She chose to betray, but then her daughter gave her mouth. I'm George, 51, and I live in Texas with my wife, Marina, 43. Marina has a daughter, Chris, now 20, from her first marriage. Life has generally been good, or so I thought, until recently. First, a little backstory. I come from a family of farmers. Our tradition is that each generation takes over the family farm when the time comes. At 30, the torch was passed to me. I poured every ounce of myself into that farm, driven by a promise I made to my father when he was battling cancer. I vowed to turn our modest operation into an empire. It was my way of honoring his memory and ensuring his legacy would continue. And not to brag, but that's exactly what I did. Over the last couple of decades, I have built a vast enterprise, diversified it into several projects, and I can confidently say that we live a life of comfort and success. I did not marry young. Relationships took a backseat for years while I focused on building my empire. Marina came into my life just when I was ready to share her with someone. We met at work. She was a smart, ambitious woman who eventually became the CEO of my company. Working together brought us closer, and one thing led to another. We got married, and for a while, I thought I had it all, a thriving business and a partner who shared my vision. But recently, things took a strange turn. I began to notice small discrepancies, nothing shocking at first, but enough to throw me off track. Marina, who had always been meticulous in her work, began making uncharacteristic mistakes. Several documents were lost, some reports were not signed, and there were calculation errors. At first, I brushed it off as stress or a bad day. But then I did it home. It stuck in the back of my mind, though. I made a mental note to stay on guard, and I'm glad I did, because that was just the tip of the iceberg. Shortly after, I was cleaning her office in the evening, an old habit from my days helping my dad on the farm, and found a bottle of men's cologne hidden behind a stack of folders. That's when my anxiety grew. It wasn't my cologne. I'd been wearing the same scent for years. I didn't confront her right away. Instead, I began to pay closer attention to her. Marina's behavior had changed slightly over the past few months. Sometimes she seemed distracted, often glued to her phone or leaving the house to answer unexpected calls. When I asked, she brushed them off as business inquiries or Chris just needed some advice. At night, she stayed up later than usual, scrolling through her feed or texting in bed. If I glanced at her, she quickly locked her phone. I decided to test the waters. "What's that cologne in your office?" I asked one night while we were having dinner. She didn't flinch. "Oh, it's a gift for one of our clients," she said softly, smiling and pouring herself more wine. I thought it might be a nice touch for our holiday thank you bags. It sounded plausible, but something about her tone was off. You know that gut feeling you get when someone is lying but you can't prove it? That's where I was. I ignored it for a moment, but made a mental note to look into it further. The other day, I came home early from a canceled meeting to find Marina working from home. She didn't hear me come in, so I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her. She looked deep in thought, almost sad. When she finally noticed me, she smiled. But it was a forced smile, like she was trying to hide something that was bothering her. I racked my brain trying to figure out what could be going on. Is she stressed about work? Worried about Chris? Or is it something about me? The real turning point came a couple of nights ago. I was working late at the farm, going over inventory reports and sorting out some equipment orders. When I got home, Marina's car was not in the driveway. Nothing strange about that. She sometimes stays late at the office or meets clients for dinner. But when I walked into the house, I noticed an envelope sitting on the kitchen table. It was plain, unmarked, and addressed to me. Curiously, I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a handwritten note. "George, you're not seeing the big picture. Check the East Barn tomorrow night at 10 p.m. Friend." My first thought was that it must be a prank. Who leaves such cryptic messages in someone's kitchen? But as I stood there, rereading the note, something about it nagged at me. The East Barn hadn't been used for anything significant in years, not since we expanded the main farm operations. Aside from some old equipment and supplies, it was practically abandoned. I couldn't imagine why anyone would want me to look in there. I debated whether to show the note to Marina, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the tone of the message, or the fact that it was addressed to me so personally. Whatever it was, I decided to check it out alone. The next evening, I drove to the East Barn just before 10. The place was as quiet and dark as I'd expected. As I got closer, I noticed a faint glow coming from one of the windows. A flashlight, maybe? My heart started pounding as I stepped inside. At first, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. The barn smelled of dust and old wood, and the familiar clutter of tools and equipment filled the space. But then I heard it, a soft murmur of voices. They were coming from the far end, near the attic. I crept closer, trying not to make a sound. When I was close enough to peer over the top of the haystack, I froze. Two men were standing in the shadows, talking in hushed tones. I couldn't make out much of what they were saying, but I caught a few words here and there: shipment, deadline, keep quiet. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. These weren't workers or neighbors, at least, not anyone I knew. And what were they doing here, of all places, at this hour? Before I could decide whether to confront them, one of the men pulled out a set of keys and unlocked a small storage locker against the wall. From where I stood, I couldn't see what he pulled out, but it looked heavy. They exchanged a few more words before heading for the exit. I ducked behind the hay bales, holding my breath until I heard their footsteps fade away. Once I was sure they were gone, I stepped out and walked over to the cabinet. It was empty, save for a few bolts and a rusty wrench. I tried to make sense of what I had just seen, but nothing made sense. Why were they here? And what did they take? When I got back to the house, Marina was already asleep. I stood in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the note on the counter, wondering if I had made a mistake. Maybe I should call the police, but what would I tell them? That two strangers were talking in my barn and took something? That didn't seem like enough. The next morning, I decided to dig a little deeper. I checked the barn during the day, but found no signs of anything out of the ordinary. Then I started thinking about the note itself, who had written it, and why they thought I needed to know about the barn. I couldn't shake the feeling that Marina might know something. When I casually asked her if she'd seen anyone hanging around the house, she looked confused. "No, why not?" she asked, sipping her coffee. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "I just thought I saw some tracks near the East Barn. Nothing, I guess." She didn't press the issue, but her answer left me more upset than reassured. A week after the whole incident at the East Barn, something strange happened. I got a call from an unknown number. I thought it was another telemarketer or someone trying to sell me something, but I answered anyway. To my surprise, on the other end of the line was an older man I didn't recognize. He sounded calm. He asked if we could meet at an old pub on the outskirts of town. He didn't say anything else on the phone except that he wanted to talk about the note I found in the kitchen, with a cryptic message. Now I know it sounds strange. An old man I've never met asking me to meet him at some seedy pub? Yeah, I thought the same thing. But there was something in his voice that made me feel like I had no choice but to go. Like he knew something I didn't. He even admitted that the note was his doing. That was the hook that made me agree. So that evening I found myself sitting in a dimly lit corner of a rundown pub, sipping a drink and trying to figure out what was going on. When the man finally emerged, he looked older than I expected, probably 60 plus. But he was dressed casually, like someone who didn't care about making a first impression. And then, to my surprise, I recognized him. It was Gary, my guy from the tech department. Gary had always been a bit of a loner, but he was a sharp one when it came to tech. I hadn't even noticed he was the one behind the note. But there he was, looking me straight in the eye, talking in a low voice about the strange events I'd been experiencing. "I've been keeping an eye on things," Gary said, leaning in close. "I noticed those two guys you saw in the barn. They're not just there. They're here for a reason. I was checking some old equipment and I saw them. I think your wife works on them." I didn't want to believe him. I couldn't. Marina had always been so reliable, so organized. But Gary wasn't the type to make things up. At first, I said nothing. Instead, Gary reached into his pocket and pulled out an old, battered tape recorder. He pressed play, and suddenly the voices of two men filled the quiet of the pub. There they were, the same voices I'd heard in the barn. The conversation was hushed, but I could make out snippets. They were talking about deliveries, deadlines, and something about keeping the information confidential. And then, Out of nowhere, one of them mentioned Marina's name. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. The words hit me like a punch in the gut. Gary stopped the recording and gave me a look that said it all. I'm not saying you need to face her right now, but you deserve to know what's really going on. I didn't know what to say. I barely had time to mumble a thank you and promise Gary a bonus. Honestly, I didn't even know if I was thanking him or just trying to collect my thoughts. I didn't say anything to Marina. Instead, I spent the next few days combing through everything I could find in her office. I looked at reports, invoices, and documents. I wanted to believe that I was wrong, that there was some logical explanation. But the more I dug, the worse it became. I discovered that some of our product had been sold to other stores, businesses I'd never heard of, for months. The income reports didn't add up, either. Our official revenues were lower than they should have been, and the numbers didn't match what we sold. I didn't work with those businesses. Then there were the fake reports, the ones Marina had brought me, doctoring the documents to make everything look good, to cover up the deal she'd made behind my back. And that's when it all clicked. This wasn't just some mistake or a series of unfortunate events. No, Marina was running her own side business with these two men, taking a cut of the deliveries and laundering the money, and I was left in the dark the entire time. I was angry, confused, but most of all, I felt betrayed. I didn't confront her right away. I needed time to process it. I needed to figure out how to deal with it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to do something. So I waited. And that night, when Marina was home, I went straight to our bedroom. I didn't even knock. I just opened the door. And there it was. Marina was lying in bed, tangled in the sheets, with one of the men, the same one I had seen in the barn. I didn't even have to ask who he was. I recognized him immediately. Anger boiled up inside me, hot and suffocating. I didn't say a word. I just snapped. Everything I had been holding back for the past few days came pouring out. I started smashing everything, furniture, papers, anything I could get my hands on. Marina was crying, begging me to stop, but it didn't matter. The man dressed quickly, his eyes wide with fear, and ran from the room. I didn't even chase him. I focused solely on Marina. I grabbed the reports and papers, the ones I had found with the fake documents, and shoved them in her face. "Get out," I said in a cold voice. "You're finished. Get out of my house." And just like that, she was gone. But that wasn't the end. No, that was just the beginning. I was sitting at the kitchen table, drinking whiskey and trying to calm my nerves, when the door opened. It was Chris. She looked shocked, standing in the doorway, her eyes wide as she surveyed the wreckage around her. She asked where her mother was, why all her things were gone. She didn't understand. She couldn't. I'd raised her since she was 12, and she'd always been like a daughter to me. But I could see it in her eyes, the confusion, the fear, the grief. I told her to sit down. I needed to tell her the truth. And she cried. She cried like I'd never seen her cry before. Then Marina called. I couldn't hear much, but I saw her daughter's face contort with anger as she listened to what her mother was saying on the other end of the line. And then she screamed. "I never want to see you again," she screamed, tears streaming down her face. It was like a switch flipped. She didn't want to go back to her mother. She stayed with me. Over the next few days, we spent time together, drinking wine, talking, trying to numb the pain. It wasn't healthy, but it was all we had. One night, we got so drunk that the walls between us seemed to disappear. And I don't know what happened, but she ended up sitting right on top of me. We moved to bed, and there she started doing unearthly wonders with her mouth. I can't say I'm proud of it,